Hey guys, it's Rachel with Restorations by Rachel. I feel like I should be having you join me at this table. This is my project this week. It is a table and 6 chairs. I had someone reach out to me through one of my listings on Facebook Marketplace and say, hey, I have a table and chairs that I need to have refinished. Is that something you'd be interested in? So I went and met her and talked it over. And she agreed with my price, and so here we are. I'm excited. This is going to be a pretty big project. I think the most time-consuming piece of it will be the chairs. Those are pretty tedious to strip, sand, all that, but I think we can get to a place where they're happy with it. I'm happy with it. So let's get going. It's going to be a lot of work. So since I'm stripping it, I'm not going to worry about cleaning it or anything to start out with. I'm using Smart Strip Advanced paint remover. It has worked well on a couple other projects, and I like that it's safer to use than your chemical sprayer, or not sprayers, but strippers. I will say, like, I think this is about 25 bucks. So I've only used it on 2 small projects, so I don't feel like it goes particularly far, but you are paying for just being better for you, for the environment, all that stuff. So we'll see how it does on this finish. Excited to see how it goes, because it is, from my experience, it is effective, and I've seen others use it and it be quite effective, but I think that I'm probably only going to be able to maybe get the tabletop done with what I have. I might have to come in with some of my green easy stripper that I have. I have plenty of that on hand.
Another thing you may notice is that I'm having to dip my brush in there and then apply it, dip it again. That's one downside to it being a paste. With a liquid stripper, you can just pour it on there and spread it out, and it's so much faster. But with it being a paste, it does work better on vertical surfaces.
But I'll just get this on here, let it sit for a couple hours. The work time, I always forget, from 3 to 24 hours. They do have like some almost like wax paper that you can put on there to help it stay wet, but it was really expensive when I looked it up on Amazon. It was like 20 bucks or something for 9 feet worth. And I was just like, yeah, I'll use some plastic wrap. So while I would love to try it out, I just don't want to try it out at that price. So I will get some plastic wrap and just put it on here once I'm finished to help it stay wet. It probably will be around the 3-hour mark before I come out here, but we'll see.
I ended up putting Green Easy on the other side, and my dad was in town. You could see he was out here helping me with the plastic wrap.
Okay, it has actually been almost 6 hours since I put this on, so it has had plenty of time to sit here and work. Hopefully it's not dried out or anything like that, but I'm going to go ahead and start peeling it back in sections and scraping this stuff off. This is where it would have been much easier if I had put down like a plastic tarp. Just drop everything down there. Oh yeah, it's scraping off really well. I mean, look at that.
So I made my way across where I'd put all the Smart Strip on there to get all that off. It went well until I got to the Green Easy stripper.
So it's kind of funny, the difference in strippers. The Green Easy kind of melted the plastic too, but so I couldn't really peel it off, but it is working just as well as the Smart Strip did. So it's going to be a little bit messier as I take it off, but it is going smoother because the Smart Strip dried out a little bit more on me. And you can see right there where my scrapers has a little bit of friction. That's where that line where the smart strip was.
The plastic wrap sticking to the Green Easy stripper is actually going to cause me problems later when stripping the chairs, but you'll see me trying to deal with that later. Thankfully, on this flat surface of the table, it was not a problem.
Okay, now it's time to clean it up. I'm going to first come in with Green Easy's finishing cleaner. I have a steel wool pad, it's a quadruple zero, and I also have a bucket of water that I can help, or that I'll use to help wash it down and get it all good and clean. But this will help with getting the gunk residue off of there.
This step is important for two main reasons, in my opinion. One, to get rid of any residue of that stripper, because you don't want that there when you are going to sand, because you could possibly grind it down into the wood. And then secondly, it's going to make your sanding go faster as well. Circling back to the comparison of the Smart Strip and the Green Easy stripper, here I felt like the Green Easy stripper actually took off more of the finish. It's lighter on that left side versus the right side. I know I still have the apron and the legs of the table left, but I decided to switch to stripping the chairs. And this is where the real fun started. I knew it was going to be tedious, but goodness, I did not anticipate how tedious it ended up being. I first started with stripping. I wanted to compare the Smart Strip and the Green Easy as well. My method was to put the Smart Strip on there and then wrap it in plastic wrap so it could sit. That worked well. The removal was still quite tedious. You can see I'm using my scraper and I'm having to work in sections. The legs, I found it best to use a paper towel to just rub a lot of that stripper off of there and then come in with a brush with that I've been dipping in water, brush and brush and brush, and then dip it back into the water. It was soapy water, I guess I should say that. Overall, it did work well, but I could already tell with the first one that I was like, man, this is going to be a long time. And the thing with stripping is, especially with chairs, that you want to be as thorough as you can, because it's going to make your life so much easier when it's time to sand, especially when you're thinking about the corners of the chair. Like, you want to get as much of the finish out of there as possible, because it's so much harder to sand out the finish from any corners. This time I decided to clean up after the stripper with acetone. You know, there are a lot of methods you can use to clean, and so sometimes it's just a matter of seeing what works best for your project or just what you prefer. I poured some in a glass jar and then just dipped my quadruple zero steel wool pad in there and went to town. You can see it's taking it off really well. I also had some scrub brushes that I use for some of the nooks and crannies. One key thing about acetone is that it evaporates and dries rather quickly, so you have to work in sections and make sure you wipe back quickly. You remember on the tabletop where the plastic wrap was sticking to it? Well, that wasn't that big of a deal when I just have this flat surface that I can run my scraper over. It was sticking to all these little turns and crevices on the chair, and it was not good. So I kind of abandoned that for what I did get off of it and switched to trying acetone, which I had seen several other furniture flippers do as well. To be fair, I do think that the stripper dried out a little bit on me, so it made the plastic sticking to it even worse. But you know, this method ended up working really well for me and something I used for all the rest of the chairs. For my first chair that I used solely acetone, I have a bristle brush that has pretty firm bristles. I later switched to something that has softer bristles. It worked a lot better because I felt like, I don't know, just with how the way this scrubbed, it took me a little bit longer than I anticipated. I pour a little bit in there at a time because it's going to get pretty mucky and dirty from the finish, and you're either going to have to pour it out or try to, I would soak paper towels into it to get that last little bit of the acetone in the cup so I wasn't wasting it, and then rub in some areas. And you can see in this shot just how dirty it gets. Very important factors too, I wanted to point out. I'm wearing safety glasses so I don't have any splash into my eyes. I have on gloves to protect my hands. It does eat through the gloves if you're dipping it in the acetone a lot, so I went through several. I'm also wearing my respirator. You just want to be very careful and very mindful of your lungs and your skin with working with anything that's harsh like acetone. As you're working and scrubbing over the chair, as you strip the entire chair, it's going to create lots of splashes throughout. So I went over it one last time with just a paper towel that I soaked in acetone to get off the rest of the residue. So it only took me an hour and a half. Lots of mess later. And I'm being very sarcastic about only an hour and a half. But I got some tips from the friend who originally told me about it. I got another brush to try, and I'm planning on being more liberal with the acetone usage on the second one, and hopefully it'll go faster. Those couple changes did make a pretty big difference. It went from about an hour and a half to 70 minutes, I think is around what it timed. So still a long time, but at least it was quicker than the other one. And I do think it was faster than applying stripper, wrapping it with the plastic wrap, and then scraping it all off and then cleaning it up. So the acetone in this sense was kind of like a one-man show. It did all the things that you needed it to do, but it was a bit more hands-on time probably. I would say the downside is it is quite messy and you go through a ton of paper towels. So, you know, if that part is important to you, it's a bit wasteful. I think stripping probably uses less paper products. So my overall conclusion, I will probably use acetone in the future if I have detailed areas like this, but for flat surfaces or mostly flat surfaces, I think stripper's the way to go.
For the apron, I'm going to see if maybe my scraper will do a good job of getting a lot of this finished off before I go to acetone. I'm going to just do some practice runs first, but if you are doing this, I would wear a mask to protect your lungs because that's still going to create dust in the air, but I'm just going to do a little bit of practice with holding my breath, trying not to breathe it in. All right, that looks like a good use of my time. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish up with this.
So scrapers are a fantastic tool to use if you do not want to deal with stripper. You do get a good arm workout, so that's that too. But it's effective for pulling off that finish. I will say you want to be careful that you aren't digging in too hard and you want to make nice smooth strokes so you're not scraping the wood at all. This is solid wood, so thankfully if I did gouge it, then I could probably sand it smooth, but you still want to do that. But so you want to be extra mindful if it is veneer because that could easily, you could pull it up. Now for some of the areas of the base that I knew would be difficult to sand, I did come in with acetone to get rid of the finish there. Now it is time to move on to sanding. I'm starting with an 80 grit. That's going to help take back a lot of that finish that's left. I'm also using that rougher grit because this is solid wood, so I'm not worried about burning through the veneer. If it was veneered, then I probably would start with 120 instead of 80. One thing that was kind of crazy is that I noticed a lot of swirl marks on here, and this is from the manufacturer. When I see something like this, it's always surprising to me. Okay, now to move on to these curved edges. I'm using my Surf Prep sander and I have a foam abrasive attachment on there that you can attach your own sanding disc to. They have discs that already have like the grit built into them, but I've been reaching for this in this project and I've liked it. You can see I am using an orbital sanding disc on there and it works just fine. I opted to use 120 grit just so I could be a little less aggressive with how much I was taking off. I wanted to be very mindful of the contour edge, so I would keep that. But as you can see, it works really, really well. I also used it on the legs where it had this routed corner. Since there were a lot of right angles on this base, I opted to stay with my Surf Prep sander, and that way it helped me get to those areas a lot better. I will say that I was pleasantly surprised at how quick it was to use the scraper and then come in and sand. The scraper was really key to getting off whatever protective coat it has on there. I think that's like the most difficult thing usually to get through. And then once you're down to the stain, that comes off rather quickly with sanding. This is real time, so you can see how quickly it's actually working. I'm using 80 grit here. Now back to sanding the chairs. So the finish was stripped off there generally pretty well. So I'm starting with 120 grit. I also don't want to start with 80 grit because that means I would have had to go through one more grit in order to get it sanded down to 220, which is where I'm planning to be for my stain. And honestly here, guys, this is where I for sure decided I am not going to do chairs ever again. I don't mind tedious work, but something about the chairs, man, they got me. It was quite a bit of going back between the foam abrasive. I could use my orbital sander on some of the areas, but it was mostly just a lot of detailed sanding and trying to be patient. This first sanding of 120 grit to really try to get rid of all the finish, it took me a good hour. And then to go through the 180 and 220 together, that was probably another hour or so. So if you're doing the math, like I'm over 3 hours, probably more like 3.5 on each chair, and I haven't even applied stain or top coat yet.
All right, I spoke with the client and she does not like this distinct variations in the wood tone. So I'm going to use oxalic acid to bleach the top and even this out as much as I can. I have 2 cups of very warm water. Hot warm water is what you want, so the crystals of the oxalic acid dissolve. And then it's 1 tablespoon of oxalic acid to each cup. So I'll be using 2 tablespoons, but I'll put my respirator on and my gloves on before I do that. So you want to be using proper PPE. Just protect your skin, your face, lungs, all that stuff. And I'll put on my safety glasses as well.
So I'm just using a cheap chip brush to spread it around. That way I can just use it this time and toss it. Using this method, it didn't quite work that well. It lightened it a little bit. So then I went in with a second round that I used double the amount of oxalic acid. So I used 4 tablespoons for the 2 cups, and it lightened it some, but not as much as I was hoping. I will say that oxalic acid is really good for taking out stains like from water rings. I have used it. Barkeeper's Friend actually has like its main ingredient is oxalic acid. So I've used that and made like a paste out of it and scrubbed it and gotten out water rings. So it is effective, but maybe just not a total bleaching agent in this instance that I needed it. Anytime after using a bleaching agent, you're going to want to neutralize that bleach that is on there. I don't fully know the science behind it, but I know one's an acid and one's not. So you are going to just dilute some baking soda in water and then brush it on, or I started pouring it on and then brushing it that way. But it's pretty cool to see the reaction. It starts like bubbling, kind of like where you have vinegar and baking soda, and it makes that foamy reaction. After that, I will then wipe it down with some clean water and a rag. And this is where things took a turn for the worst. I had researched some ways to hopefully lighten the wood a bit more. Zinsser has a great 2-part bleaching system, but it was out of stock everywhere I looked. So I went to using diluted bleach. Well, my research was like, yeah, just do this, put it out in the sun, it'll be great. Well, after it turned the wood green, I later found out that it can pull some green tones, like the wood tannins out of the wood. So after trying not to completely freak out, I was like, well, I guess we will neutralize this again and then go in and sand, and hopefully it will sand back if I sand it long enough. And it did. But it took me a good 3 hours to go through all the sanding that I needed to get it back down to not green. Because I hadn't just done the top, but I'd also done the legs, the sides, Oh man, why did I do this when I had never tried this before? So learn from my mistake. Only test it in a small area that you could fix if you need to, rather than costing yourself several hours of unnecessary work. Before we move on to staining, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things about the chairs. There were lots of areas that it was pretty difficult to get to with the sander. So I have this contour sanding kit that worked so well with trying to get into these little nooks and crannies. You want to be very mindful of sanding with the grain. You can see here I'm going up and down. It would have been a lot easier for me to just go sideways, but that would have created these funky scratches in the wood that maybe I don't see now, but once you apply stain, that would really show up and just not look that good.
Okay, I know I look like a mess right now with my respirator marks and everything, but I wanted to take a moment to celebrate that I am finished with these chairs, sanding them at least. I've got to stain them, but goodness, like that was probably over 3 hours per chair, 3.5 maybe. I wouldn't be surprised if it was that long, with all the stripping and sanding and wiping down, cleaning, etc. It was a lot of work. I have refinished some chairs before where I just did the seat and painted the rest, and you know, it apparently is just way longer than I could have thought for doing the rest of all the detail work. So I'm so glad to be finished and on to the staining process. It's getting dark out here, so I'm going to hopefully pull it inside and work on that tonight. Inside where I'll have better light, and we'll see how much I can get done tonight.
The stain I'm using is Antique Oak by General Finishes. It's thankfully a stain that I had on hand and worked well to match some pieces in their house that they were wanting to match. I'm using a combination of a chip brush and a foam brush. The chip brush was easier for these bigger areas to wipe on, and then I just wipe it back with a lint-free towel. If you want to give yourself a little bit more time to work, you can do a bit of a slip coat with a spray bottle just to dampen the surface before you add the water-based stain. I chose not to do that this time since I was inside, but it is a really good method for giving you some more time. Some of the key things I watched with doing these chairs is, one, each section, I didn't want to overlap onto another section as much as possible, because sometimes that can create darker areas at those intersections and it just doesn't look as good. And secondly, before I move on to another section, I am trying to make sure I wipe back all the excess so there aren't any streaks of finish that's left. There was some areas that happened to me and I had to sand it back and then reapply the stain, but thankfully it was just a few. There were a couple areas that I was maybe the most nervous about applying stain and making them look even. One of those areas was the turn legs. I made sure when I was doing this section to apply the stain very heavily so that give me more time to work. And then I just took some paper towels and worked in sections to wipe away the stain. I would make sure I wiped down the larger sections first before then going into the little nooks and crannies to try to get whatever excess stain was in there. The most difficult section was this area that went on the inside of the chair and went all the way down the whole length of the chair. What made it difficult was that, one, it was long, so I needed to break it up in sections already so it wouldn't dry before I needed to wipe it back. And then two, I'm having to go around this cross piece there in the middle. And so what I did is I worked just below that cross piece, and then I would start back at the top and wipe it back, but still leave a wet edge. And that's what's really helpful if you're trying to not leave a line, is to have a wet edge. And then once I wipe back, I would come and put a little bit of stain on the wet edge and then make my way down and do the rest of the section and wipe it back. And that worked well. And here it is all finished. It took me a good hour to do this one chair. So if you're doing the math, it's about 4.5 hours so far. And there's my little helper hanging out with me. But Yeah, these things are time consuming, so just be aware. And I want to show you the back of this. You see how it's streaky? That was one area that I had to redo, but it was pretty simple fix. I just sanded it back and reapplied the stain. I didn't record myself reapplying the stain because you see me do that, but as you can see, it looks so much better. Once I got all the chairs complete, it was time for the tabletop. So I am doing one half at a time, and I am using a paint edger. I found that's very helpful with covering a large area as quick as possible. I am making sure that I put it on very thick, and then I'm going to start wiping back, and I will leave a wet edge just like I did on that area of the chair. Now on this side of the table, I thought that I could do one half at a time, but it actually proved to be a little difficult if I did that. So on the second half, I'll work in smaller sections. And the process is basically the same as the chairs. I'm trying to wipe back all excess, not leave any streaks because it's really hard to fix that. Now, as you can see, the stain has absorbed very unevenly and it's pretty splotchy. This made me think that it was maple because I know maple is notorious for accepting stains unevenly, but the clients came by to look at it and were okay with it. They knew it was going to be kind of a rustic feel anyways, so I proceeded with staining the rest of it. And the edge of the table absorbed it really quickly where I couldn't wipe it back very well. So I ended up sanding that back and reapplying the stain in sections. And here you can see it dry. It did look a lot better, but still some splotchiness. Now earlier you probably noticed this big gaping hole on one of the sides of the table. Well, it used to have a drawer. When they purchased it, it did not have the drawer. It was missing. So they asked me to create a faux front. So off to Lowe's I went. I picked out a whiteboard because that was what I felt like would match the best. And my sweet little helper helped me take it to the front. Once home, it was time to cut it down to size. I always like to cut the edge, make sure that it's square because it's not always 100% square from the store. Then I cut it to length. The opening was 18 inches, so I cut it to 19 inches so there'd be half an inch overlap on each side. Thankfully, I did not have to rip it down, that the height was perfect. It's a 1x4 board that I got, so it's actually like 3/4 of an inch by 3.5 inch, and that was great. I sanded it with 220 grit to get it ready for the stain. I also went along the edges. She asked that the edges would be a little softer, a little angled, somewhat similar to the edges of the table. I have not used a router before. That would have been more ideal to get like a true look to like the edge of the table, but one day I will. I have one in a box, and I will get brave enough to try it. And because you can create some really neat designs with it. And then it was time for a quick stain application. I did front, back, and sides. It probably wasn't necessary to do the back, but I just went ahead and did it because it was pretty easy. Then to attach it, I just used my brad nailer. The board was 3/4 of an inch deep, and the other board on the other side was 3/4 an inch deep. I didn't have quite the depth of nail that I wanted, but I went ahead and used the 1.5 inch and it worked great. You may notice that I've already stained this side, so I had already stained the sides before cutting that piece down. I ended up using my mister bottle. I love this thing. It's really great. It's pretty inexpensive too, but it's great for applying a slip coat, like for a paint wash or for stain in this matter. And I just use my paint edger to apply the stain and wipe back like everywhere else. So I did that on the apron and then on the legs, and it went pretty quickly and thankfully absorbed pretty evenly. After more hours than I care to count up, it was finally getting close to the end. It is time for the top coat. I'm wiping back the top, making sure there isn't any dust on there. I'm just using an old t-shirt. I keep these on hand. I'll use them for wiping back sanding dust, just kind of whatever I need. And if they're not too nasty, then I'll just put them through the washing machine and use them again. For the top coat, I am using Minwax polyacrylic top coat. It's a water-based top coat, which I prefer using. Sometimes for tabletops, an oil base is good because it's a bit more durable, but it can also have a tendency to amber over time, and I talked to the client and they preferred for that not to happen. So I'm using this one and it works well. For my sprayer, I have the Flexio 5000. The settings I'm using are, it's blowing out of 4, and I have the flow not very open because top coat is pretty thin. So you want to be careful with that you don't spray too much because then you'll get drips, and that is such a pain. As you can see, spraying this table was a little challenging. I was very grateful for my long arms. What I've found that is nice to do, I had another furniture friend share this. It's Julia from Flying Dutchman Furniture. She's on Instagram if you want to find her. But she, for her top coats, she said that she puts on one top coat, does not sand in between, because there's a chance that you could sand through the top coat and into the finish. And I was like, that is such a good point. So it works still well if you put on that first top coat and then put on a second and then do your sanding to help smooth out any nubs or anything like that. That's what I did here. I put on 3 coats total, sanded between the second and third, wiped back all that sanding dust, and then applied the third coat, and it was like glass. It was so pretty. An area that I really agonized over was this tabletop. I just wasn't happy with how splotchy the stain was, but I had them come over and look at it before I changed anything, and they were actually okay with it. So I was really grateful. But I did learn that for the future that there is a product called Seal Coat. It is de-wax shellac, and you can apply that to the raw wood and then apply your stain over that, and that will help with making an even stain. Okay, y'all, it's been a while, so let's look back at where we started. The tabletop had lots of scratches on it, had that orangey hue. The chairs were quite splotchy themselves and didn't match the table. But here the set is now. As you can see, I did not bring it into my house this time, but I hope that you can still appreciate its new finish, that those scratches are all gone. The table and chairs match so much better now. Yes, I would like for the stain to be more uniform, but I want to share my mistakes that I make and what I learn as well. I can't tell you what a doozy of a project this was for me, but I'm so glad it's done and that the clients are happy with it. As always, I'd love to know your thoughts. I so appreciate you tuning in and supporting my channel. If you haven't subscribed already, I would love for you to hit that button and follow along for my next videos, and I'll look forward to catching you next time.